But I bet if you told 1,000 people you're playing a game and you have the following policy changes to uh, make sure that everyone graduates from college, make sure that everybody is healthy, make sure that racism is eliminated, that as many people would pick those choices as would pick create a new WPA or raise the minimum wage or create a bigger earned income tax credit as the solution. But in fact, my argument is that all those other things that improve the relative competitiveness of people, all of which are good, aren't going to solve unemployment or poverty.
Welcome to the Harmony of Interest series, where we explore ideas that shape our world. My name is Evan Papp, and I'm the executive producer of Empathy Media Lab that produces content on labor, political economy, art, and culture, and we're a proud member of the Labor Radio Podcast Network. Today, I'm speaking with David Riemer, who is author of Putting Government in Its Place, The Case for a New Deal 3.0. He's also the author of The Prisoners of Welfare, Liberating America's Poor from Unemployment and Low Wages. David is a senior fellow at the Community Advocates Public Policy Institute and senior advisor for Social Security Works. David's service during the past 4 decades has ranged from preparing city and state budgets to advancing major reform in state and national employment, income, health, and education policy. David, thanks so much for your time.
It's a pleasure to be on your show, Evan. It's a pleasure to meet you and to share this discussion for the next hour, hour and a half, 2 hours, whatever it takes.
Well, it's going to take a lot longer than that, but we'll try to make the audience stay interested in the next hour or so. So I would love to hear about your background. So could you begin by talking about what first got you interested in policy and politics?
Well, the story begins in the near the place where I was born. I was born in central Pennsylvania, a little town called Bellefonte, which is the county seat for Center County. I was born there because even though we lived in nearby State College, the site of Penn State University, where my parents lived, where my father taught at Penn State, didn't have a hospital at the time. So my dad actually had to hitchhike back and forth in order to visit my mother at the hospital. I grew up there in the 50s and early 60s before moving to Milwaukee, where I now live. And towards the end of that period, especially in the early 60s, as you and many of your viewers and listeners will know, it was the height of another important round, a very key round of the civil rights movement. My parents were New Deal Democrats. My father became pretty actively involved in the local effort to support civil rights. He, for example, was involved in organizing a boycott of the barbers in town because they refused to cut the hair of Black students at Penn State. So as a result, I got my hair cut by him for a couple of weeks until that matter was addressed. It was a small price to pay for, but I suppose you could call that my first indirect contribution to trying to make life better, fair for people left out and left behind. In 1963, my father joined a small group of Penn State students and faculty who went on the March on Washington. And I always have kept ever since then this button that he brought back. I think you can see it there. Mm-hmm. This is the official button of the March on Washington. March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, August 28, 1963. Dad came back and gave me this as a memento. I've kept it for all those decades. And it may be a good starting point to answer your question. Why was it a march for jobs and freedom? The conventional wisdom at the time was that everybody who wanted a job could have a job. And that if you didn't have a job, it was because you were lazy, or because you were discriminated against, or because you had a handicap, a disability of some sort. But the premise was that the jobs were there, and most of them were good. The civil rights movement, quite appropriately, included an effort to create equal access to employment, as well as to other rights, public accommodations, transportation, eventually voting rights. But among many people across the political spectrum, there was a belief that the jobs were there and that most of them paid well. Well, Dr. King knew better, and the organizers of that march, which included A. Philip Randolph, who's the head of the Sleeping Car Porters Brotherhood, and then his top aide, Bayard Rustin, they understood that the labor market itself had a lot of problems. And as you know, and many of your viewers know, towards the end of his life, Dr. King, while not in any way giving up on the importance of civil rights, began to focus more and more on economic rights. When he was in Memphis, where he was murdered, he was there to support the garbage workers, the sanitation workers, trying to get better wages and other conditions. That was a civil rights matter because such a high proportion of them were Black, but it was also just about wages, economic security. And he gave a number of important speeches towards the end of his career that focused on that. So I had this kind of in the back of my mind. Jobs were important. What was wrong? What was the issue? What was the problem? I didn't finish my schooling in the state college public school system. My father, who had taught at Penn State for quite a while, ended up getting a job in Milwaukee with the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Our family moved to Milwaukee, and I went to a very different public school here. It was an integrated public school. There's a long backstory to this. The Milwaukee School Board had sought to intentionally segregate the public schools in Milwaukee, but they didn't do that for the one school I attended, Riverside High School, which is in the northeast corner of the city of Milwaukee. So for the first time, I was interacting in class and in extracurricular activities with young, Black men and women and Hispanic men and women, a very diverse student body, not just along color or color lines, but also along ethnic lines. Milwaukee is a city that a lot of Eastern European immigrants had come to from Germany, from Poland, from what was then called Yugoslavia, and many of my, from Ireland. So many of my classmates who were white also were very diverse. I actually ended up writing a story about that for the local high school newspaper. I called it a school of immigrants. I talked about all the different origins that people had. This was intentionally a play on, the late President Kennedy's book called A Nation of Immigrants. So I graduated from Riverside High School in 1966 and went off to Harvard College. And I majored in modern European, which meant for me English and French, history and literature. But I had a pretty strong interest in public policy and politics. Like a lot of people in this era, we're now into the mid to late 60s. I was a volunteer on the Eugene McCarthy campaign in both New Hampshire and in Milwaukee. In fact, by sheer coincidence, I happened to be in the corridor of the hotel just a few minutes after Lyndon Johnson had gone on television to announce he would not be running for re-election in 1968. And who comes walking down the corridor but Gene McCarthy, Senator McCarthy. So that was maybe my first brush with American history, or at least my second after my dad coming back from the March on Washington. I went to law school after graduating from Harvard, went to Harvard Law School. And I had a number of just excellent professors there who had been involved in government and public policy. And a number of them I want to mention. One was Professor Abram Chase, who'd been legal advisor in the State Department to both the Kennedy and Johnson administration, was a real mentor to me. Another one was Stanley Surrey, who was the author really of the concept of tax expenditures. In some way, you would imagine that a class in law school on federal income taxation would be near the top of boring, but it actually was a fascinating one because Surrey brought to life the fact that deeply embedded in all these often arcane rules in the tax system are hundreds of policy choices about what should be taxed, how much it should be taxed, what should be exempt. And those weren't just technical tax decisions, they were policy decisions. He came up with the idea of viewing the economic impact of all these exclusions and deductions and credits as being the equivalent of Congress appropriating money. So I began really at this point to move away from sort of thinking in very broad terms about public policy and politics, and to get more into the nitty-gritty of it. There was a quote, I think it was, I'm not sure if it was from a former Harvard professor and later Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, it may have been somebody else, but I heard it as attributed to him, that justice was embedded in the interstices of procedure, which fits in with what was going on in the 60s, the Gideon decision that gave people the right to counsel if they were indigent, the Miranda decision, which gave people who were suspect in criminal cases the right to be informed they had a right to a lawyer and that anything they said could be used against them, and a whole series of other procedural changes. But I began to come to the conclusion that economic justice was embedded in the interstices of budget and the tax code. So this was a prelude to my later on becoming both a city and a state budget director. Before I finished law school, I spent a couple of years in Washington, and I worked for a group called the Citizens Advocate Center. This was a group that was that my mentor Abram Shays had suggested I apply to. I was accepted, and I worked there for a man named Edgar Kahn, a remarkable man. I met him a couple of years ago, and I hope he's still well. And he had been involved after graduating himself from law school, working with then Senator Bobby Kennedy and then later Sergeant Shriver in developing the war on poverty, and particularly in developing the legal services program. While there, I got my first assignment in drafting a law. So again, this is part of the migration from concepts, abstract concepts of justice, to budgets, to law, writing words, which if approved through a political process, become law and then transform for the better the lives of people who very often don't even know that that's what's happening, but nonetheless benefit from it. So I was assigned to help then State Representative Shirley Chisholm's office. She was a remarkable African-American member of Congress from, I believe, Brooklyn, and I believe was one of the first African-American Democrats to run for the nomination at one point. I may have some of my facts wrong here, but I was asked to draft a federal bill that would create the Legal Services Corporation. Well, this was 1971. It didn't get past that year, but a few years later it did. So I'm beginning to again get into the nitty gritty.
And what was the Legal Services Corporation?
Well, the going back to the Gideon decision, Gideon versus Wainwright, that established the right of an indigent person to have legal representation in criminal cases where there was a risk of being deprived of liberty, or in theory, potential loss of life, imprisonment, or a serious fine. but the poor didn't have any right or even coherent national program to representation in civil matters. So if you were being evicted, or you were having your home foreclosed, or you were having your refrigerator repossessed, or you were having your wages garnished, and you were poor and you couldn't afford a lawyer, you basically were dependent on charity to have someone go to court and basically argue that this was not legal, or that the solution wasn't a fair one to you. So the idea behind the Legal Services Corporation was to create a national network of law firms that represented the poor. And eventually that law passed. And that's why we have, if you will, divisions of the Legal Services Corporation still in existence all over the country. There are not enough lawyers in this organization, but it made a huge difference. Very often they were able to file class action lawsuits. So instead of just helping a single client, they were able to get court rulings that, change the rules for hundreds of thousands, millions of clients potentially. For me, this was about what a bill looked like. How did you actually write a bill? What words did you use? What cross-references did you have? How did you structure it? So I was engaged, if you will, in these years in a kind of informal apprenticeship in how you translate concepts of social and economic justice into the nitty-gritty of law, public policy. The most important thing that I did during this period, this was 1971 to 73, was that I was asked to look at the effectiveness of what were then called job manpower programs. Federal, they were then called manpower. That wouldn't be what they'd be called today. Today we would call them job training programs. They had names like the Manpower Development and Training Act, or the Neighborhood Youth Corps. The one that was, you'd probably recognize, and it's still around, is the Job Corps. There were a number of these. And the question was, were they actually effective in getting unemployed people jobs? So I learned a couple of things there. One thing that I learned was that before and after doesn't necessarily mean cause and effect. I came across a study of a Job Corps program in Indiana, I believe, and it did show that after getting the experience of being a Job Corps trainee, as I recall, there was an increase in employment, but it turned out that the program couldn't accept everybody who applied. So they did a kind of a random assignment like they do in a medical experiment. And it turned out that the control group that didn't get the Job Corps training ended up with more employment and better wages than the group that got the training.
That's not a good
right.
achieving the goals of the program. So.
Right. Well, why did that happen? Well, no one really knew, but the suspicion was that they remained back in Cleveland or wherever they had come from, and they just went about applying for jobs, getting rejected, often getting accepted. Friends or neighbors would tell them about jobs, and they would go through the process that young men and women normally do when they're looking for work. They sometimes get work, and they sometimes then move on because they prove to their employer, I'm a good worker, or they get a reference. The people in the Job Corps program may have been getting technical skills. These people were getting on-the-job training and references. So that was the hypothesis as to why the people that didn't get in the training did somewhat better. But what it did was this raised for me the important question, well, what are the obstacles for unemployed people to getting work? So that led me to, frankly, just do some browsing. This was obviously decades before the internet, where you could easily get everything online. So I just ended up, grabbing copies of Census Bureau reports and Bureau of Labor Statistic reports. And I came across information which, was completely new to me, really eye-opening, although perhaps many of the experts already knew. I looked at the characteristics of poor people. And it turned out that an awfully lot of people who were poor were workers. And a fair number of them were working full-time and year-round. So this created a huge question for me. Why is it that if you're working, you have a job, you don't have the problem of being unemployed, that you end up being poor? So this led me to just sort of wonder what was going on in the labor market. Why was it that this was happening? Well, I never lost that thread. Finished law school. I had the great good fortune, with the help of yet another law school professor, a fellow named Lance Liebman, who in my very first year, first class, first day, first hour of law school, he was the first law school professor I encountered. He later went on to Columbia Law School, where he had this extraordinary career as Dean of Columbia Law for many years. And fast forward to just a couple of years ago, he was kind enough to write one of the endorsements of my book. But he helped me find a job working for this extraordinary governor of Wisconsin, Patrick J. Lucey. So right out of law school, I got that job. I had an opportunity to work in the private sector for a big Boston law firm. I declined that. It was a fine firm, but I wanted to be a public interest lawyer, and I wanted to be involved in public policy, as opposed to, for example, being in the Attorney General's office or the FTC or many of the jobs that were available to young lawyers. So I kind of narrowed my opportunities in ways that reduced the possibilities. So I was quite fortunate to get this job with Governor Lucey, and quite fortunate to be working for this really legendary governor at a time when the Democrats had just gained complete control of the state legislature, and later on that control increased. So I had the chance to work with him and some legislators in literally drafting and advancing numerous bills within the legislative process. So again, this was sort of a latter stage of my apprenticeship. I was involved in drafting legislation to create a voluntary school desegregation law for Milwaukee. The U.S. District Court Judge John Reynolds had declared that the Milwaukee Public Schools was illegally segregated. This goes back to what I said earlier. The school board had consciously decided to segregate the schools, and they had done so in such a clumsy manner that there was an ample record they had done that. So the judge heard the case, reviewed the evidence and said, this is illegal, and ordered the school district to desegregate. The legislature under Governor Lucey and a very strong leader in the state legislature, a state representative named Dennis Conta, who was also one of my mentors. I basically, to say they asked for my help is maybe a bit much. I said, I'd be glad to help you as much as you want. And they said, okay. So I was involved in drafting this bill to create a school desegregation program. Later on, I was involved in drafting legislation to create a state public defender program. In other words, to take the requirement of the Gideon decision and turn it into a state agency that provided all across Wisconsin independent lawyers to represent indigents in criminal cases, and then later on in mental health cases, juvenile cases. And I'm mentioning these because what I'm trying to do here is explain that I became increasingly versed in how you take a broad idea, translate it into specifications, translate it into a bill draft, and then understand and work with elected officials to get that bill not just heard in committee, but passed by committee, passed by one body, amended by another body, accepted and signed into law by the governor. So this was a sort of self-guided tutorial,
Yeah.
much of which was blundering. I didn't really know what I was doing or looking for. But the next phase in this process, and then I'll stop and then get back to you. And I'm sorry for going on so long.
No, it's all right. I'm very interested, and I have a few questions that
Sure.
I'll wait till you finish this next point.
But about the time I began working for the governor, I also got to meet a group of labor organizers. And I can name some of their names if you like, but this was a group of labor organizers who were working for the United Farm Workers, working for Cesar Chavez. They'd been out in California doing a variety of work, including literally going into the farm fields and getting people to sign petitions, and dealing with bullies from the sort of the company union that was trying to break the farm workers. So these were people who had direct organizing experience with low-income people. I met with them, and over the next several years, we decided that, that what was needed was a national organization that focused on changing federal policy, local policy, state policy, but ultimately federal policy, to get unemployed people jobs and get unemployed people higher wages and better benefits. The initial name was I can't even remember what the initial name was, but later on they changed their name to Congress for a Working America, trying to emphasize that the goal was to get the United States Congress ultimately to create a new set of laws, building on the New Deal, building on the Humphrey Hawkins bill that, at that time still living Senator Hubert Humphrey and Gus Hawkins, Representative Hawkins from California, had introduced to get Congress to pass legislation to continue what I didn't fully understand at the time, but basically fill the gaps and the flaws of the original New Deal. So in the course of working for Governor Lucey, and later on in other jobs that I held, I worked continuously on my own time with this group. And when we began to have some success over the years, we were able, for example, as the organization morphed and changed, to get the state of Wisconsin to create a transitional jobs program, a kind of new version of the CCC, the WPA, very small program that nonetheless offered jobs to unemployed people who couldn't find work easily. We were involved in creating a state supplemental earned income tax credit. It was the first in the country to both be refundable, which technically means you get the credit even if the credit exceeds your tax liability. So it actually paid people even if they didn't owe any more in taxes. And also it was unique, not only being in refundable, but adjusting for family size. The federal EITC didn't do that yet. That waited till President Clinton to be adjusted for more than one person, more than one worker, or really more than one child per worker. And then under President Obama for 3 or more. I got heavily involved in healthcare. And for a while, a lot of people would have defined me as a healthcare lawyer. So I was involved in improving the Medicaid program, expanding Medicaid through a program called Badger Care. I'm smiling here because I know you grew up in Michigan, where your mascot is the feared Wolverines.
Oh, yes.
I've got that right. And of course, in Wisconsin, the mascot is the Badger. And so a lot of things are named Badger. So working with the Republican governor, Governor Thompson, and his Secretary of Health Services, former state legislator, very excellent appointee named Joseph Leon, they decided to call this Medicaid expansion Badger Care. So this was an expansion of Medicaid before people were talking about Medicaid expansion, but I was heavily involved in that legislation, including helping to persuade the state legislature to adopt the plan on a bipartisan basis, and then persuading the Clinton administration to grant the necessary waivers. So I was involved in the administrative aspects of it, the state legislative aspects of it, and the federal waiver administrative aspects of it. But all of these things were meant to help unemployed or low-wage workers make work available, make work pay more, through the supplemental earned income tax credit, and then to help workers or low-income people. But we're talking mostly about workers, because the original Medicaid program covered people on welfare, people getting disability benefits. It didn't cover low-income workers by and large. So this initiative was meant to expand Medicaid to this vast group of low-income workers. So that's why it was so important. So I began kind of working on all these fronts, mostly during a period when I was, where my day job was working for the mayor of Milwaukee, a man named John Norquist. He was mayor from 1988 until 2004. And I was his budget director, administration director, chief of staff, on and off, for almost that entire period. So let me stop there.
It's an incredible experience on a lot of people outside of government who don't understand the bureaucratic implementation of policy, how policies and legislation is made, the management of it, trying to get in the political will. It's very few people that have the experience in all of those levels, and actually from passing a bill to actually implementing a program. Before we get into the rethinking government framework that you've laid out in incredible detail, I want to take a step back, because I'm from the Midwest, as you mentioned, born in Cleveland, grew up in Michigan, lived in Illinois. Mm-hmm. And there in Wisconsin, I find a very interesting culture, in the sense that like many parts in the Midwest, there was a large industrial base, immigrant working class communities. You have the northern migration after the Civil War, and you have some extremely progressive places in Wisconsin, like in Milwaukee and Appleton, and at University of Wisconsin in Madison. But then you have these tremendous reactionary elements, like the John Birch Society and Senator McCarthy, and then and Scott Walker and trying to destroy the public sector unions. How do we have, and this is such a broad question, but you've worked with Republicans, you've worked with Democrats, and you've seen the evolution over time and where we are today. I guess within that context of these contradictions, how did you approach how you came to these policies? And it seems like if the Republicans were supporting a Medicare expansion, that is, I think, better than many Republican governors today that don't even accept Medicare funding to punish the quote unquote federal government when they're actually publishing the people in their state. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, being in Wisconsin.
I have a lot. The first thing, just to clarify, the Medicaid expansion, Badger Care, that took place in the late 90s when Tommy Thompson was governor, and the legislature was sort of divided, I think, much more closely between Democrats and Republicans. That's different than what today we call the Medicaid expansion, which many blue and red states have accepted, but Wisconsin increasingly isolated as a red state that's refused to do that. But I think that the difference, frankly, between staunch Republican Tommy Thompson and the Republicans now who control the legislature, no longer the governor's office, that's part of the story. We have in Wisconsin, 4 political traditions. It's somewhat unique. Going from left to right, we had a very strong socialist party in Wisconsin. Literally, card-carrying socialists were the mayors of Milwaukee all the way, almost the entire period from 1910 to 1960. Emil Seidel, Daniel Webster Hone, and Frank Zeidler were the mayor for almost that entire period. And they were, proud socialists. Now, I should point out to any listener who isn't familiar with this, that they were what we call sewer socialists. That was actually an insult thrown at them by the communists, by the far left socialists, who said that these socialists, all they cared about was better sewers, better water systems, swimming pools, good government.
Material improvements?
Yeah.
Instead of just ideological.
To which the socialist mayors, and there was a socialist majority on the city council for a while, big membership, if not control, on the county board, and several socialist members of the state legislature. They weren't embarrassed by it. I mean, they ideologically, they may have one day imagined that that the workers would become strong enough that they would take over the means of production and all of the kind of Marxist, ideology rhetoric. But in the meantime, they wanted people to drink good drinking water. They wanted people to be able to flush toilets and take baths and dispose of stuff from factories without it getting into the water supply. They wanted garbage pickup to be efficient so that rats didn't crawl around, the dust bins. They wanted to be sure that people could go to swimming pools. They wanted to be sure that there was clean air to breathe, that there were parks, that there was recreation. They helped push what's called the lighted schoolhouses. So they were very important in the late 19th and early 20th century, all the way up until the 40s or 50s. So that was one stream of social and political power. The second stream was the Democrats. Until the 70s, the Democrats were pretty weak, almost to the point of pathetic. The socialists had sort of eaten a lot of their lunch, had sort of pulled away a lot of their support. Remember that Wisconsin was the birthplace of the Republican Party. And there was, and I'll talk about the progressives in a minute, but a lot of people who might otherwise have been Democrats were attracted to the Progressive Party. So the Democrats tended to be pretty weak. In the first decades, the state became a state in 1848. The Republican Party, I think, first took power in 1856 or so. So there was a brief period of, the Democrats having control. But after that, they were a small party. Typically, they only got elected in a few seats in the state legislature, and they only held, office here whenever a Democrat would become president in Washington, and then the postmasters and the customs folks would be appointed Democratic loyalists. That changed beginning in the late 40s. There was a period briefly before that, during the New Deal, when the Democratic Party had a brief revival, and they won the governorship. One of Fighting Bob La Follette's sons, I'll get to him in a second, but one of his sons ended up Phil La Follette, running as a Democrat for governor. And the Democrats then took over a lot of the statewide offices, gained some power, and did a lot of good. I believe that's when Wisconsin adopted unemployment insurance in advance of the federal bill. But that was a brief shining moment. And then after that, the Republicans took over power. What happened at the end of the Second World War was a lot of returning GIs like Pat Lucey, Gaylord Nelson, a number of others formed something called the Democratic Organizing Committee. They met in Green Bay, I think it was 1948, and they consciously decided to wrest power from these old guard Democrats who really had no organization, no power. And beginning in the late 40s, all throughout the 50s, with Lucy as the lead in the rebuilding of the party, they took over the party and they began building power, running for office, running for every office. And by 1957, they had their first breakthrough when Bill Proxmire ran for the seat that had been given up as a result of Joe McCarthy's death. This was, I think, the first time in a long, long time where a Democrat had won a statewide office. And then in 1958, Gaylord Nelson was elected governor, and then so on. Other Democrats began winning statewide office. Lucy eventually was elected in 1970. They took the state assembly. In 74, they took the state senate. And that sort of was just the time preceding when I came back to Wisconsin. So I benefited from this rebirth of the Democratic Party. But my main point here is that was new. The Democratic Party in Wisconsin was essentially moribund for almost a century. So that was the second stream. The third stream, and the dominant stream in Wisconsin history, was what you might call moderate to conservative Republicans. The party was founded here. I think Republicans elected almost all of the governors and controlled the legislature almost entirely from 1860 until, the 70s, with a couple of interruptions. There was a Democratic governor around the same time as Grover Cleveland, who I think his name was Peck, Governor Peck. Didn't last all that long, and then again in the Depression with Phil LaFollette. But one thing people have to understand about Wisconsin was the Republican Party was the dominant party for over a century in the state. And these were traditional, by and large, traditional conservative Republicans, not keen on government, supportive of, minimum regulation, pollution, who cares about that? Workers get hurt in factories, well, they should negotiate better contracts, not real interested in either economic security or in regulation. They were laissez-faire Republicans. And then the fourth stream was a kind of breakaway movement from the Republican Party, the progressives. There was a national progressive movement, as you know, that lots of people were involved in. In Wisconsin, it started out as a branch of the Republican Party.
And this is in like the 1890s, I believe, like
right.
in Minnesota and
right.
You have it in North and South Dakota. And it's also, I think, the farmers reacting to the price of gold changes and the loss of the US dollar and the greenback at that time. So they were just getting crushed.
Right.
In
and
agriculture.
There also was concern about railroads charging whatever they wanted to charge to bring things from farm to market. There was concern about the environment, about the stripping of the land. And so LaFollette clearly was the spearhead of this movement. And he, ran for governor, was elected. But his main focus, his main opposition was the rest of the Republican Party, even though he was still a Republican. Eventually he created this other party, the Progressive Party, under whose banner he ran for president at one point. Teddy Roosevelt took over as the candidate in the election. Taft, Woodrow Wilson, Teddy Roosevelt, which some people say that three-way race enabled Wilson to win. Other scholars say no, Wilson would have won anyway. But the larger point was that for much of its history, the progressive movement was part of the Republican Party. It was a breakaway movement. And interestingly enough, Robert LaFollette passed away. His son, Bob LaFollette Jr., young Bob, took that seat in the Senate as a progressive at first, as I recall, but then later on he became a Republican. And he won the Republican primary in 1940 and then lost in 1946 to, this, I think, a Winnebago County Circuit Court judge named Joseph McCarthy, who played on his war record, Tail Gunner Joe, to defeat La Follette in the 46 primary. There's some evidence that part of why La Follette lost was that the Communist Party urged its members to vote for McCarthy, hoping that the left of center Democratic candidate could then win the general election. That actually led to a book I once read suggesting that McCarthy was secretly an agent of the Communist Party because they helped him get elected. And then he so embarrassed himself in the Senate that he discredited the anti-communist movement. So who would do that except a communist? So if you think that the idea of conspiracy theories and all that fake news is new, we'll all have to think again. But again, the main point I'm trying to make was that you've got these four streams: the socialists, the traditional Democrats who were moribund, except for a couple brief periods, and then became a permanent, enduring party, to some extent absorbing those who otherwise might have been socialists, and many who would have been progressives. They kind of pulled people in from both the socialist side of things and the progressive side of things. And then the Republican Party, which for a while was formally split between progressives and what, sort of stalwart Republicans, I think is what they called themselves. But the stalwart Republicans were the dominant group for most of Wisconsin's history. So what you saw with Tommy Thompson and what you saw with Scott Walker and the current legislature is what you might consider an internal movement within the stalwart part of the Republican Party, moving from its kind of traditional position of being somewhat sympathetic to some of the progressive ideas, like funding the University of Wisconsin, high level of funding for public education, supporting conservation to some extent. That was where Tommy Thompson was, to where Scott Walker and the current folks are, which are, much more Trumpish, anti-intellectual, somewhat condescending towards the university, opposed to, government parks and environmental stuff, opposed to raising the minimum wage, exposed to the second Medicaid expansion that I mentioned earlier. So, but there still remains, even in the Republican side, some people who emotionally, intellectually are still rooted in the stalwart Republican, the Main Street Republican model, who believe in government. They just want to be careful about its size and its functions. They're conservative in the traditional sense, as opposed to the current group, which is in some ways not conservative at all, very radical, wants to use government aggressively to promote their ideological agenda.
And it's always important to note that Scott Walker received a tremendous amount of funding from, I believe, some of the Koch brother funding and some Wall Street funding as a way to undermine unions. And I guess my point in asking that question, because I'm always fascinated with the history and the dynamics of these changing parties and the party realignment, this concept of moving from the Whig to the Republican to the progressives to now whatever they are, and the Democratic Party changing from being the Southern Confederates to then becoming a part of the FDR New Deal. And I do believe that we are going through this party realignment right now. And it is, we may not know exactly how deep and the change is going to happen, but there is no guarantee that the Republican Party is going to maintain itself as a national party 20 years from now. I mean, we could see the Republican Party become a regional party with the Democratic Party splitting. So I just find it's very important to bring up these many different dynamics. And that's kind of, I think, a good opening to talk a bit about your excellent website that guides the reader through a detailed plan and policy process that's laid out in your book, Putting Government in Its Place, The Case for a New Deal 3.0. And you have it, outlined in these sections. And the first section is rethinking government. And you write, quote, set aside the debate about the size of government and concentrate on the more important question of what exactly we want the government to do. And you use this analogy as the government being a stage. So could you talk about why you use the metaphor of the stage and what you would like to see the government do in kind of this broad general opening?
Sure. Well, let me talk first a little bit about why size is in my view, a somewhat silly measure. When I would speak publicly, I would often point out that when your house is on fire, your first thought, if you're a conservative Republican or otherwise, is not, this is a time to have a smaller fire department. I want government to do less. I want the fire department to not exist, or if it does exist, not come to put my fire out. No one wants government to be smaller in a crisis like that. They want it to get there quickly with competent people and good equipment and put the fire out. Democrats, on the other hand, are often stigmatized as favoring big government. But when I was growing up in the 60s, as I talked about, part of the job we were trying to do was to have less government. We wanted government to stop deciding that, if you were Black, you had to go here, and if you were white, you had to go here. The idea was get government out of the business of what store a person could shop in, or what school their kids could go to, or what job they might have. And today, I do think a fair amount of the liberal, progressive, whatever you want to call it, agenda is to have less government in certain areas. So big, little, more government, less government is, to me, a whole tin can of red herrings. It doesn't help. The real question is, as you said, what do we want government to do? And my basic belief, if you step back and sort of think about it objectively, or I guess I guess we all say that what we believe is objective and what other people say isn't objective. So maybe I shouldn't say it that way. But I do think that most people would agree that there are three broad functions that today we expect government to perform. The first is to provide public safety and health. This is why we have the armed forces. Almost nobody is against the idea of having a powerful and effective Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, and so forth to protect us against foreign threats. We can argue about how many ships, how many battalions, how many weapons, how much we should spend, but there are very few people who would say that no threat exists and that we should have none of the above. And public safety extends to the local level. We all want police. We all want firefighters. I don't even think that the people who say defund the police are really talking about getting rid of police departments. They're talking about changing how the police are trained, about how many of them perhaps are, about how they respond to various crises. But when I talk to Black and white and men and women and poor and rich, everybody wants the police to be there to respond effectively to crime. Most of us recognize that there's some people who perform very violent, wicked acts, and they should be tried and convicted and sent to prison. You can argue again about the death penalty. I'm against it. Lots of people are against it. Wisconsin doesn't have one. I'm glad of that. You can argue about lengths of sentences and parole and probation, but we want a system of public safety. And clearly in this era of COVID, anybody who doesn't believe in a system of public health, of the CDC being on the lookout for viruses like COVID-19, like swine flu, like all the ones that we talk about, this is really important. And this goes all the way down to the local health department, making sure that restaurants are safe to eat in, making sure that the FDA making sure that food is inspected, the agriculture department playing that role as well. We want to be sure that drugs that we take are safe and effective. So who's against this? We can argue about the details, but clearly this is a function of government. I would argue that there is now consensus, and this wouldn't have been true before the New Deal. This was really the New Deal's big innovation, that government has a role in ensuring a measure of economic security for the overwhelming majority. Prior to 1933, I think most people would have said government's job is to be sure that there's opportunity. But if there's a lot of people unemployed, if a lot of people are poor, as long as they have the opportunity to compete for whatever jobs are there, the opportunity to get a good living, even if more than half, even if a vast majority don't get that, as long as there's a chance to knock on that door and go through it, that's enough. So, but I think today most people agree that government should, as a matter of policy, seek to make sure that people have work, that people have enough income, that people have protection in some form against the major risks that even a good salary can't guarantee. The risk of dealing with a catastrophic illness or long-term care, the risk of kind of a good risk of having a child that wants to go to college, but the college costs $10,000 or $40,000 or $50,000, and how are you going to afford that on a typical middle-class salary? So I think that there's consensus on that, and where the debate is that as to exactly how to achieve that. That's not unreasonable. You have to remember we're arguing still about what's the right thing to do for public safety and public health. Those have been functions of government literally for millennia, certainly for centuries, and we still haven't got absolute agreement on that. It's hardly a surprise that when it comes to economic security, which has really only been a federal function since the 30s, that we're still, hammering out. What do we mean by that? What do we want? As we'll get to it, what did the New Deal do what we want, or should we do something on top of it different than that? Some people want to roll back the New Deal, which I think would be a terrible decision. But that's the second major function. And the third major function is regulating the market. We have a market economy. People generally like a market economy, but participants in the market tend to dump. Economists call it cost externalization. They tend to, if they can get away with it, be open to, think about, and too often act upon lowering your costs by putting chemicals in the water or in the air. They tend to think about maybe running a factory or an office that's not safe, or producing products that maybe are risky or dangerous, or not fully disclosing the facts when they're selling stocks and bonds. So I think there's, again, general acceptance of the idea that government needs to say to buyers and sellers in the market, there's some rules of the game, and the rules of the game go beyond caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. The rules of the game go beyond the ability of an injured party to sue in court for negligence. That government should say, we don't expect all the buyers and sellers to have enough information and enough expertise to implement caveat emptor. Therefore, government with expertise should come in and say certain practices either are completely disallowed, or they are taxed, or there's a fee attached to them, or we're going to try to educate buyers and sellers to avoid them. And there's four broad areas where this regulation takes place. Protecting the environment, which involves often protecting public health and safety, protecting workers, protecting consumers, and protecting investors. My argument is that when you add those three broad areas of government activity together, this is the argument of the book, those three legs of the stool, public safety and health, economic security, including enabling people to get healthcare and get education, which you might call equal opportunity, of 90% of us to do what the rich can do on their own. And then thirdly, properly regulating the market, that provides a foundation upon which, a stage upon which the drama of social and economic life play out. And I actually believe, and this may come as a surprise given what you've heard and what viewers may be perceiving, and given my background working with Democrats, I'm actually a believer in limited government. I think that government should build that stage, lay that foundation, and do it well and do it solidly. And in areas where there's something missing, where the stage is missing a big pillar underneath it, we should build that pillar. Where there's holes in that floor, we should fix them so people don't fall through. But I'm not a big fan of having government do more than provide that foundation. So as you've read in the book, I actually believe that if you design the economic security system correctly, we can get rid of what most people define as welfare, means-tested programs that require you to be poor to get help, and then punish you when you do what you often want and what a lot of the rest of society encourages people to do, which is work harder, don't refrain from marriage if that's what you're otherwise inclined to do. And more importantly, well, of equal importance, I think that government effort to interfere in the market in the sense of picking winners and losers, choosing particular kinds of consumption and investment, is not government's business. So I think that an awful lot of public spending at the federal and state level and the local level, and a lot of tax policy, which basically amount to having government say, we like this sector of the economy. We even like this particular firm. We're going to give them a loan, a grant, a tax break. I would get government out of that business altogether. Instead of having the government pick winners and losers, my belief is that consumers and investors making informed choices within a properly regulated market and bringing into that market adequate employment, earnings, income, healthcare, and education, that they should be the ones to decide the direction and the shape of the marketplace. And if that involves more renting or more home ownership, that's the people's choice. Government shouldn't be coming in with a big thumb and saying, we want more of this and less of that. If people want to eat more corn and fewer string beans, or more lettuce and less rice, those are private decisions. Government shouldn't be saying, we're insisting on more corn and more rice and fewer string beans. That's not the business of government to do that. Government should not be encouraging particular kinds of of making a living. Earnings, dividends, capital gains, royalties, all the different ways you make money should be treated equally. Government shouldn't be saying, we're going to tax earnings a lot more than dividends and interest and capital gains. Let people make choices as to the way in which they go about making money. So I would argue in many ways, more conservative, more free market than a lot of the people who claim that they are.
Well, I really appreciate that laying out the vision, where I think even in some of today's very charged rhetoric, even the sense of having a market, some people will criticize even when it has done good. And you're also familiar, I'm sure, with Lincoln's quote that the wolf and the sheep define freedom differently. So the wolf will say, you're impinging on my freedom by putting those sheep in that fenced in area. And the sheep will say, well, if the wolf is at my neck, you're impinging on my freedom as well. And so within that context, and coming out of the 1950s and 60s, where the tax rate of the highest earners and income tax when there wasn't as large of a dividends process and things like that. I mean, under Eisenhower, it was almost up to 90%. And that came out of obviously wartime, New Deal economic, the footing that led to kind of the recovery of the United States going into the war and coming out of it. So the idea of a stage is a very neutral ground. And I've also heard that the government's a shield in the sense that it's either protecting this group or that group, or maybe it's protecting everyone within that group. Have you heard that concept, or that, or what? How's that metaphor?
Yeah.
With you, with the idea that some people are need to be protected against other people, and I think that's what you said, is that under certain regulations that allow for freedom, because you're ultimately talking about letting people to live freely, but in an equal manner, I believe.
Well, I think the shield metaphor applies to government regulation that functions to prevent dumping, prevent cost externalization. Part of why I didn't use that, well, part of it is I hadn't thought of focusing on that metaphor, but part of it is going back to Lincoln. It's almost impossible to find a Lincoln quote one disagrees with. I hadn't heard that one, but that's a great one. But what you don't want to do is have a shield that's used to protect a particular economic sector or business group. I suppose I would make an exception if a particular economic sector or business or product is needed for defense purposes, truly needed, not just said to be needed, but really needed, then government may have to come in and say, look, we need more aluminum, or we need more whatever. But that's usually used as an excuse just to subsidize the aluminum manufacturers or whoever. Government shouldn't shield particular sectors or corporations or individuals against competition. The whole idea of a market is to have consumer sovereignty, informed consumers moving their resources in terms of consumption and investment towards the goods and services that they want. That's going to cause certain folks to lose. I don't want to shield the losers. Now, I do want to be sure that as individuals are entangled in the process of loss, that they still have work, that there be work available for them and a decent income. But I don't want to shield anybody's store, anybody's sector of the economy. I don't want to give anyone a special privilege or a special subsidy. Let me give you one example of a bad shield. I think it's still on the books. There's this entity called the Cranberry Marketing Committee. I refer to it in my book. And this is essentially, I think it's sponsored by the US Department of Agriculture. Under their aegis, the cranberry growers get together and they decide how many cranberries each of them is going to grow. So they're shielded against competition. The purpose is to be sure that they profit as cranberry growers. Well, I love cranberries. Wouldn't have a Thanksgiving without it. But I don't think it's the government's business to shield the cranberry growers any more than back in the day they shielded the tobacco industry. It's one thing to make sure that banks are well managed. They are trustees of our money. It's one thing to make sure that there's deposit insurance to protect investors. But I don't think we should shield a bank from, going out of business if it's poorly managed.
Sorry. I'm just gonna push one more question at you, and then we'll get to a little bit about some of the design principles and
Sure.
move through some of the other sections. So in the New Deal, you had bankruptcy of farms everywhere, and the idea was, okay, farmers need, it wasn't necessarily just about bailing out farmers when you come up with this parity farm pricing of how much does it actually cost to create a bushel of corn. When you think about the plants, the equipment, the transportation, the labor, the rent, the interest, the inputs, everything that goes into actually creating that bushel and trying to figure out what that price is. Now, with that parity farm price floor, you then essentially subsidize businesses that would go out of business. However, there is the argument that if you don't have an agricultural sector, you're going to then be dependent on imports of agriculture, and that can lead to insecurity on the global realm as well as insecurity in regional areas when you don't have enough food in areas. So how would you respond to something like a agricultural parity price?
Well, I'm not in favor of agriculture subsidies, whether it's through parity or quotas or whatever. To me, the solution to this is to make sure that virtually everybody has income. We'll talk about the different groups and how to get people income. But if people have an adequate income, the second thing they're going to do with it, maybe the first thing, is they're going to go to grocery stores and buy food. And that's going to create a demand for agricultural products. And that's what should keep American agriculture afloat. Now, it may be that in order to make sure that competition from abroad is fair, there may be a need to make, this is not an area where I'm an expert in, but I understand the argument that if there's a minimum wage in this country and it's far higher than the minimum wage in country X or Y or Z that's producing agricultural products, that even though they have the disadvantage of distance, the extra cost of shipping, they are able to sell at lower prices because they underpay their workers. They don't pay them enough.
Or lower environmental
standards. This, however, is a problem that's generic to all American sectors. This is true to manufacturing, it's true to services. Should we have rules or quotas or add-on charges to equalize the costs of production between domestic versus foreign competitors? And I've gone back and forth on that. I have different views about it. My belief, however, is that even with some of the requirements that are imposed on American firms, which are imposed, on most European firms as well, and are going to be increasingly imposed, I believe, on our biggest competitor, just through market forces, on China. I think that if we had Americans with income making choices within a properly regulated market, I think that by and large, the agriculture sector would do just fine. And efficient producers of agricultural products, all up and down that chain, from the person that plants the corn to the person that mills the corn to the store that sells the barrels of wheat to the work that my grandfather used to do as a baker. That those that are good and efficient in that work, in those different lines of work, will be able to survive and prosper. Well, the groups that will be hurt are the agribusinesses that are actually the predominant beneficiaries of those subsidies. Archer Daniels Midland and some giant rice growers.
Cargill.
People in the agricultural world try to portray some of these subsidies as benefiting the family farmer. There's some of that, but most of the money goes to these giant ag businesses. Why in the world federal taxes are higher and payments are made to support Archer's Daniels Midland or any large company is beyond me. This has nothing to do with any valid public purpose. So at the very least, we should restructure subsidies to agriculture so that they go to people who really need the help. But I would argue that we go even deeper, provide economic security, provide good incomes, make sure the market's properly regulated. ward off unfair competition, which we should do generally, perhaps a question mark, do something to define unfair competition as competition from foreign companies that don't pay a decent wage, ignore environmental standards, mistreat their workers, and say, well, we're not going to let you sell in this country at all, in some cases, or if you do, we're going to tack on a surcharge to that, which you can reduce by paying your workers properly and dealing with pollution. So basically, hold out to them the key to avoiding the problem.
Yeah, and the tariff to prevent dumping that's been around since the beginning of this country, and
Right.
Antitrust to break up cartels, monopsonists and monopolies,
Right.
anything the unfair trade or unfair competitive practices. So the next section is titled New Design, which spells out 10 design principles cutting across all policy and programs that should guide the restructuring of government at every level. And could you talk a little bit about some of these designs, with your first principle focusing on adults? Why do you begin there?
Well, I think that there's often a tendency to segment the people we want to help into different groups, long-term unemployed, or people in rural areas, or people in central cities, or children, or people with a disability. And there are times when those distinctions matter, but there are a number of reasons why I think that it's better to focus just on adults as the primary unit of analysis. First of all of the groups that we're talking about are either adults or the children of adults, and who are dependent as children on those adults. So if we improve the situation of adults, then we are improving the situation of the children that live with them, with rare exceptions. The other reason for focusing on adults as a group is that we avoid the problem of turning people away because they're the wrong kind of adult. Oh, this is a program just for, coal miners in Appalachia, or this is a program just for, Black mothers in Milwaukee, or this is a program just for this group or that group. Now, some of that is okay, but it shouldn't be to the exclusion of other groups. Now, I say this not just in theory, but based on actual experience. In Milwaukee, as I think I may have mentioned before, we set up a subsidized employment program. And it was a program that was meant to help not just unemployed people, but people who were either receiving welfare benefits, or young men who were in an age category where they were potentially thought to be the non-custodial parents of the children whose mothers were on welfare, and so on. Well, in the effort to get the news out to people about these different categories, a lot of people didn't understand the distinctions. So they show up, wait in line, and then they get to the head of the line, and then they're told, you're the wrong kind of unemployed poor person. We don't want you. We want the person behind you. So the more we can avoid these, I call it public policy Vegematic, where we slice and dice the poor into these different groups. And the third reason is simply to avoid, so it's a matter of fairness. It's also a matter of administrative efficiency. The fewer tests you have to apply, the fewer forms you need, the fewer bureaucrats you need, the less verification you need, the less an auditing agency or the press is going to find out that you neglected to follow the rules and embarrass you as administrator. And the third reason is simply political. Every time you focus on a group other than adults, essentially what you're doing is focusing on a subgroup of adults. Then some other subgroup feels left out. And they may say, well, I'm as deserving as that subgroup. How come they're getting help? I have the same problem. Why not me? So having eligibility for help being broad is very important.
And that political aspect of the harmony of interests, the mass traction instead of the zero-sum game where that person's gain is my loss, and then you get
Right.
these people fighting after each other.
And you'll know that most of the New Deal programs did that. I mean, there were some exceptions, and some of those exceptions were regrettable. The Civilian Conservation Corps was limited to young white men. Well, young was okay. You know, people got that, and it's an easy thing to enforce, even though actually a fair number of people who weren't old enough tried to fake that they were at least 18 or whatever the cutoff was. The same way people try to get in the Army or the Marines by, having, a bad birth certificate. But they excluded women. They excluded people of color. Now the WPA tended not to do that. They had programs either for women, which creates a separate problem of, is it separate but equal? Should the programs be not only race neutral, but gender neutral, which I would argue they should, but at least they were programs that were available for women. And in some parts of the country, not the South, but in some parts of the North, some of the programs were open regardless of color. But, so the New Deal had a mixed record on this, but generally many of their programs were not limited. The minimum wage is the minimum wage for workers, not Black workers, women workers, and so on. Now, it tended in practice to help more whites and more men, partly because more men were working than women as employees, and partly because the two categories that were excluded were domestic workers and farm workers, who tended to be disproportionately women and or people of color. That later changed. But again, you didn't have an unemployment, a minimum wage rate for Irish Americans that was different than Italian Americans, that was different than, some other group. So that was good.
Of course, there's the classification system of employment that has its own problems, where you have agricultural workers on temporary visas that have a different protections, I guess, and floors. And then what's just passed in California with the Uber law, I'm forgetting the actual number of the referendum that was passed earlier or last year, that says that Uber drivers are contractors, they're not employees. And when you do the full analysis of how much it costs for the car, the time, the gas, everything else, you can sometimes get these classifications making less than minimum wage today.
Right.
The second and third principle that you talk about is the primacy of work and a decent income. And there's a lot of talk right now about this universal basic income. Could you talk about your thoughts? I'm also very much in support of work. There's so much work that needs to be done in this country as well. And I'm very concerned about UBI, though I do absolutely think that we need welfare for people who are unemployed. And this is the next question, where when the private sector doesn't deliver enough jobs, sometimes the government may have to step in. And that may also conflict with what you were saying earlier in trying to make sure that everyone is employed, I guess. So I'm curious to dive into some of those ideas.
Well, I think there's a lot of reasons for focusing on work. One is that work is what most adults want. It's an important value to them. There's a book written by, I believe I've got this right, Catherine Eden and Luke Schaefer, in which they interview, I think it's called $1 a day. I may have it wrong, but in their interviews with people who are living on, almost nothing, a huge percentage of the people they talk to define themselves as workers. It's a very important core value for many, many people. And I can go on at great length about why that is. I mean, part of it is religious. You know, I'm not sure I mentioned this in the book, but I used to, when I was campaigning for county executive in 2004, I had the privilege of visiting a lot of Black churches, and I couldn't give a political speech because they wouldn't let me. But in any case, I wouldn't want to threaten, their status as 501c3 charitable organizations. So I gave what I call my 11th commandment speech, and I would talk about how I'm here to talk about the 11 commandments. You all heard of the 10 commandments, but if you look at the 10 commandments, they're really 11 commandments. And that's because what makes a commandment? Well, it's the word shall. And in either the third or the fourth commandment, depending on which version you look at, it says that 6 days shalt thou labor and do all thy work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath unto the Lord, and on that day thou shalt rest. So 2 shalls. And then I would ask, when God handed Moses the 10 commandments, he didn't say, well, just ignore one of those shalls. They're equally important. So the point I was trying to make, and what I hope was generally taken as in a humorous way, but serious at the same time, was that work isn't just something people do to get money. It's not just something people do to fulfill genetic, biological, sort of generic cultural needs. We're commanded to work. I mean, fewer people go to church or synagogues or mosques or whatever than in the old days, but the obligation to work is important. The Bible tells us you must work. It's not, 6 days, consider doing work if you want to or not, but you got to rest on the 7th. It's equally important. And people absorb that. That's a value that is reflected in not just the iron law of necessity, but in culture. So people want to work to fulfill all these deep cultural, social needs. They want to be able to hold their head up in the market. I was told an anecdote at one of our gatherings on transitional jobs about a young man who, in the central city of Milwaukee, I believe he was Black, but that doesn't matter really, who went to a grocery store and, gave the cashier more money. And she or he said, well, here's your change. And the person said, well, you can keep it now, I'm working. So it's a source of dignity and pride. Franklin Roosevelt understood this in a profound way. Harry Hopkins did. And I think that's part of why a lot of the New Deal programs are so based on work. FDR was someone who always worked, but there was this period when he had this polio, this disability, and he sort of, tried to go back to work, and it didn't work out so well. He worked at an insurance company, didn't work out so well. So he spent a lot of time sort of idle. And I think it got to him. And part of why he set up the establishment at Warm Springs was to give himself work to do as the owner and proprietor of this business. He understood people's need to be self-sufficient, to support themselves, not just the monetary value of it, but the dignity. So why would you want to have a system that says, well, we know you think work is important and you have this value, but we can't really think of anything useful for you to do, so here's a check, go home. I mean, I think it's almost insulting to have that as a policy, to start with the premise that we cannot find enough work for people, so here's a check, we're going to kind of buy you off, go home. The second problem with it is it's not enough money. if in fact we're talking about people who don't have a job, don't have unemployment insurance, don't have disability insurance, even giving them, $2,000 a year, or $33,000 for a kid, or $3,600 for a young kid, you can't live on that. You need a foundation to go, or a foundation of income upon which these payments function as a supplement. A lot of the advocates of this child guarantee, this child allowance, don't like my saying this, but in essence, that is a de facto earning supplement. It's just another version of the EITC. The difference is the EITC is explicitly based on work. Most of the
earned
people,
income tax credit for anyone who
right.
doesn't
The
know.
child tax credit, even if they remove any work, explicit formula in it, is de facto a supplement to earnings, because that's how most poor people live. They live on earnings. And if they don't live on earnings, they live on benefits that are associated with work. Social Security disability insurance is an earned benefit. Social Security old age insurance is an earned benefit. What does that mean? That means that people had earnings and they paid a tax. So whether you're an unemployed worker who wants work, a worker who's working, a disabled worker in most cases or many cases who had disability benefits, even many people getting SSI were previously workers. They don't qualify for SSDI yet. Or if you're getting Social Security, by definition, you earn for so many quarters. So part of what I'm arguing here is that adults are workers, or want to be workers, think of themselves as workers who want work, or are disabled workers, or are retired workers. Why fight that? Why not use that value and the history of the New Deal, which is primarily based on work? Now, some will say, well, all right, but didn't the New Deal create a welfare program? And it's true, it did. But you have to revisit the history of that. When they added what they then called the Aid to Dependent Title IV to the Social Security Act in 1935, it was predominantly for women who were mothers who had been married to workers who had either died or abandoned them. So even the ADC program was connected to work. I don't know how much of it went to women who were themselves not workers, and for whom the fathers of the kid weren't workers. Overwhelmingly, these were seen as people who were back then not expected to work because another worker in their life was supposed to support them, but that worker had either dead or jumped on a train and gone west, and who knows, maybe married somebody else even. So it's all connected to work. And on the other hand, if you were to make a universal basic income enough so that the people who don't have a job got a decent income, and then it was truly a universal basic income, we're not talking about giving people $1,000 a month. We're talking about people giving everybody $3,000 a month. I have an appendix to my book that talks about what a decent income is, what an adequate income is, and it's roughly twice the poverty line. Mm-hmm. To have a system that gives people an adequate income that's twice the poverty line, that is truly a universal income, even if it's taxed for the higher income people, that would break the bank. That would be more than, it would be, $4 or $5, $6 trillion. It would be more than all federal spending.
And that's
the argument,
the floor too. So
yeah, that's the floor. And the argument that, well, somehow we can pay for that by getting rid of, we won't need welfare programs. Well, that's true, but you would still need health insurance for everybody. The single biggest welfare program is Medicaid. And you still would need, for many people, an earnings supplement. And you still would need childcare. So you're not really going to get rid of that much welfare So there are all these reasons for it. And then there's another reason. One of the arguments for a universal income is that, well, this is for people to care for their children. All right. And I would argue that most parents of a child do in fact care for their children, including the overwhelming majority of poor parents. Let's stipulate that. But there are some parents who are irresponsible, who, who would take money and squander it, who would buy drugs, who would gamble it, or even if they didn't do that, who would plop their kids in front of a TV. And as soon as we just give money to people and say, we're assuming you're a good parent, the cry will come out, well, let's find out if they really are. And we will have audits, and we will have journalists saying, aha, we're giving $3,000 a month or whatever it is to X or Y or Z. And look what they're doing with their children. They're beating them. They're neglecting them. They're feeding them junk food. They're putting them in front of bad TV shows. They're doing all this kind of stuff. And then you come into what they used to have, and which Harry Hopkins hated, a system of defining the deserving poor versus the undeserving poor. Whose standards? How much enforcement? How many inspections? Sudden inspections? But if you don't do that, then you are indeed giving money to irresponsible parents. Now, it's one thing if we're saying to people, we're paying you for work, and after you get the money, you, like everyone else, are free to do with the money you've earned the way you want. And if you really abuse and neglect your kids, child welfare will come in and do something about it. But there's a lot less pressure if we're not just giving the money to people to have any kind of oversight. And frankly, I don't really like the idea of a program that basically creates an invitation for Big Brother to come in and monitor people's lives.
Morally means test you and everything else.
It brings us back to a lot of what we objected to in the old welfare system.
And Ford had his own thing too, where he'd go in and make sure that any of his workers had the proper housing and family life inside their home, which is very invasive and really cuts across freedom. And I would like just to add too, because Andrew Yang is one of the people who's really popularized this UBI, Universal Basic Income. Yeah. And his view though is $1,000 a month, but let's cut out all of the different types of social services. And when you add up a lot of the social services that are used from people, it sometimes totals more than $1,000 a month for at least those most in need. So in a way, it's a backdoor to undermine even more social protections, at least from his campaign that I saw.
Yeah, I mean, I'm in favor of a system of assuring people income through employment primarily, but also through employment-based programs like disability insurance and Social Security that would enable us to justify getting rid of means-tested programs. But I still think we need many of those social services anyway. People should be able to get, Head Start, early childcare education, regardless of poverty. I would love to see Medicaid disappear, but be blended into a universal healthcare plan. Yeah. So how much you really can get rid, I think, is a little bit of a, it's like a little bit of a Ponzi scheme going on there.
So I want to combine your next two parts, where one, you talk about economic security, which is kind of what you're just referring to. And you quote, "To make economic security complete, American government must ensure that every resident who wants to work has easy access to full-time employment, earns a decent wage, and ends up with an income well above the poverty line." Right. And then the next part is an effective market, which is in some ways like, how do you create a workforce that is self-sufficient and people who can find a job? Could you, bring those two up? And then what is the government's role in providing employment where the market does not? Well,
this takes us back to the future. I mean, the New Deal was all about providing work-based economic security, as we've discussed, but they drilled it down to 5 or 6 specific policies. And some of those were abandoned or discontinued, it's a better word, and some of them have frayed. And the heart of my book, the heart of a New Deal 3.0, is to construct a new and improved work-based system of economic security. So what would that be? The most important thing to do, the biggest missing piece, is a large, permanent, federal subsidized jobs program, or transitional jobs program, as it's now often called. And I think that's the wording I use in my book. That would look a lot like kind of a blend of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Civil Works Administration, the Works Progress Administration. And I can get into the weeds about the distinctions among them. But what they all had in common was the idea that they offered work, useful work, very valuable work to unemployed and underemployed people, and paid them either a wage or the equivalent of a wage for the work that they did. We urgently need a program like that. And I'm happy to say that there actually is a program in Congress that's been advanced called the Jobs for Economic Recovery Act. It's been advanced in the Senate. It's currently now Senate Bill 784 by Senators Wyden, Baldwin, Senator Wyden of Oregon, Senator Baldwin of Wisconsin, Senator Van Hollen of Maryland, Senator Bennett of Colorado, and Senator Booker of New Jersey. And it's now been co-sponsored, the last time I looked, also by Senator Gillibrand of New York. In the House, the bill is HR 1962, introduced by Representative Congressman Danny Davis and my Congresswoman, Congresswoman Gwen Moore. And this legislation would create a vehicle for providing wage-paying, useful jobs to a very large number of unemployed people until they can be absorbed in the private sector. They'd be paid a wage. They would pay taxes. They would pay Social Security taxes, and they would do useful work. Again, I could spend a lot of time in the details of that. The bill is about 50 pages long, so
I'll add it to the show notes for sure.
Yeah, right. Please do, and I can send you the links to it. But the big missing piece in the New Deal is such a jobs program. We had all those, alphabet soup programs in the New Deal. When the war came, when World War II came, they were discontinued. They were phased out. And we didn't need them during the war. Everybody who could literally fog a mirror could get a job. And this is when the government began heavily recruiting groups that were left out, women and minorities. This is where Rosie the Riveteer was not working, making rivets in 1936, but by 1944, she was desperately needed. And then after the war, as I talk about the history in my book, the world economy was essentially the American economy. We had no foreign competition. Europe was in ruins. Russia was, destroyed, and even then, because of their socialist, or their communist economy, they weren't competing with us. China was even worse shape. Japan was in terrible shape. So we owned the world economy, and again, there was a huge amount of employment available for people, even though there were periods of recession. But things began to change, and now we're back in many ways to a more normal economy. It's normal for Europe to have strong economies. It's normal for Japan to be an economic powerhouse. Historically, for many centuries, China was, falling. But in the long history, which of course from a Chinese perspective is the same as simply saying history, they were the dominant power in the world economy for centuries, when people in Europe were running around in, as Benjamin Disraeli said, painted in blue and worshiping stones. The Chinese had the sophisticated economy, as did India. So now those nations are catching up and resuming their historic place in the world economy, and it's created competition. And the combination of that with this, this technology that you and I are now using, incredible technology that is highly disruptive has caused a lot of jobs to disappear. New jobs are being created, but they're not necessarily in the same place for the same people. We have these ups and downs of the number of jobs available, the number of unemployed. It's a very volatile market. And then even for many people who do have jobs, a lot of them are part-time, temporary, gig economy jobs. So we need to have, as part of the foundation, a government subsidized jobs program. Then we need to make sure that the minimum payment you get for that work is higher than $7.25 an hour. Federal minimum wage should be clearly raised to at least $10, $11, $12 an hour. 15 is the end game, and then adjusted for inflation. Even with that, to get to an adequate income, we need to have earning supplements. What about people who aren't working? Well, I would argue that if you have a disability, you should be in disability insurance, and your income should be way above the poverty line. Then the floor should be raised a lot. Ditto with Social Security. If you work for years and years and years, often decades, and you're on Social Security, but for some reason your benefit isn't high enough, it should be raised. No retiree should be below the poverty line. They all should be getting an income well above the poverty line. Well, what about people then who have a young child? I would argue that they should have access to paid leave so that they can, in essence, get the equivalent of their earnings through a paid leave program until they're able to return to work. Remember, it's called paid leave. It's not called paid permanent income. So the premise of paid leave is you have this unique event that is for women biologically, a huge challenge. They don't call it labor for nothing, and it's obviously a huge disruption, especially a first child, but a second and third as well. So getting a leave, similarly, if you've adopted a child, and I would argue that having leave for circumstances involving helping a parent or a relative adjust to a new home, assisted living, a nursing home, let's let people take those leaves, but then return to work. And I also would argue we need a better system for helping people build up savings to supplement their Social Security better than we have. Many states are now putting in place what foreign countries have already done. We're doing it on a voluntary basis. Other countries do it on a mix of voluntary and mandatory of saving money that goes into, in essence, an IRA that goes with you as you go from employer to employer. I think California has adopted this, Washington, Oregon, Illinois. It actually has bipartisan support, certainly if it's voluntary. So the point is we lay this foundation of economic security underneath the overwhelming majority of Americans and their children. And then we say, now go forth with an adequate income and enter into a labor market that is regulated to protect you and everybody else from environmental harm, from harm in the workplace, whether it's a factory or an office. The products you buy, whether in a store or online, shouldn't burst into flame or fall apart or leak in various ways. We don't want any cars that are unsafe at any speed, to quote the title of Ralph Nader's book. And we don't want, to go back to the environment, we don't want spring to be silent, because all the critters, all the birds and all the other animals have been silenced by DDT or other chemicals. The environment should be safe, workplaces should be safe, products should be safe. And then services should be safe. When you buy a stock, buy a bond, buy a mutual fund, the entities, when you buy insurance, the entities that sell you these things need to comply with pretty rigorous standards. But, this is then a proper market with everybody participating in it, everyone bringing their adequate resources into it, and then making the choices that they want so that it's a democratic market with a small d. It's the people's market. It's not what government wants the market to be. It's certainly not what the vendors want the market to be. That's what Adam Smith was writing The Wealth of Nations against. A lot of people think he was arguing for laissez-faire, and he certainly was talking about the complex way in which the market sets prices, the so-called unseen hand, and allocates resources. But the one group that he was railing against in the Wealth of Nations were conspiracies on the part of manufacturers and other companies to restrain trade and artificially seek rent by fixing prices. So that's an unacceptable market. And I would argue it's not acceptable for government to come in with its big thumb and say, we want less of this because we want more of this. We've determined what's better for you, consumers and investors, than you're able to determine for yourself. So that's my answer to the last two questions.
Yeah. So being conscious of time, I have a few more questions left. And I am curious about your view on internal improvements by the government, where the public sector is looking at, okay, this long-term capital investment doesn't have a high enough return compared to the volatility in the derivatives market or something like that. So we're not going to put our money into a Apollo program that has a 10-to-1 return, but it takes 30 years to get back to you. When you look at like the Public Works Administration, the PWA under FDR's New Deal, they built tremendous electricity projects, tremendous roads, bridges, airports, hospitals, schools. And when you look at the Chinese model right now, they've built over 30,000 kilometers of high-speed rail in the last 10, 12 years. And we're having problems building just a little section in California. We've forgotten how to build here.
Right.
What is the role of government in investing in public works?
Well, I think that government should invest heavily in good public works. And let me just pause for a minute on good. A lot of what the PWA did, and a lot of what was done in the interstate highway building era, as Robert Moses's, terrible damage to New York City shows, and Robert Cairo's book documents, a lot of those big projects did damage and actually did more harm than good. Some of the PWA projects, turned, beautiful functional rivers into sort of, channels that did, stop the salmon from swimming upstream, destroyed wildlife, caused flooding in some cases. So I think that especially when water is involved, we need to be careful. And when roads are concerned, we should not be running big roads through the middle of cities. That was a terrible choice that's done a huge amount of damage. So I think we need to have great environmental and other concern about what are the right projects. Having said that, on the whole, I'm very much in favor of all kinds of public work investment, internal improvements. You quoted Lincoln earlier. That's part of what made him a Whig. He was a great disciple of Henry Clay and internal improvements. The one thing that I would differ on, I think, from some people, not too many economists, but unless they're paid by a particular industry, but I think that ultimately the cost of public improvement should be borne by the users of those improvements. The people that, government needs to weigh in to design, construct, locate, maybe even initially finance airports, harbors, roads, bridges, high-speed internet, high-speed trains, all of that. But we should aim to have the users, through user fees, pay both the capital costs and the operating costs. I mean, the government can borrow the money, but the cost of paying it off should be put to the users, and obviously the operating cost should be built into the fees. The more utilities, the more internal investments are seen as utilities, the better off everything will be. Compare our roads, for example, to our electric grid and natural gas grid. Now, again, I'm not saying the electric grid and the natural gas grid are perfect. They've often done environmental damage. Some of what they've done is ugly, and so on. But they do have one advantage, which is that by and large, under the aegis of public utility commissions, users pay the cost. And one can have a good argument about whether the right users are paying the right costs, but and there is probably still some tax subsidy involved in some cases. But by and large, these are, whether they're publicly owned or privately owned, users pay these costs. This isn't true for roads. There's some user fees for some roads, like the turnpikes. And we have this sort of, I would argue, bogus user fee called the gas tax, which never had a direct relationship to actual use of the road. And increasingly with vehicles that get vastly different amounts of mileage on a gallon, and some, of course, don't even use gas at all, the relationship between buying a gallon of gas and how much tax you pay for the roads has been almost completely severed. So we really don't have a user fee system for our roads, our bridges, and we should. And if we did, it would be a much better system. People would have to pay the costs, as they do for electric and gas, of maintaining the plant, fixing that system. And if the fees were adjusted as they should be for time of use, we wouldn't be building as many roads. In fact, we'd be tearing some down that have limited use, as we've done in Milwaukee, as they did with the Embarcadero Freeway in San Francisco, as they did with the West Side Highway in New York, as they're talking about doing, I believe, in Houston. So my answer is a bit complex. I'm all for the right kind of internal improvements of infrastructure. Let's do it. Let's do it big. Let's do it fast. And wherever possible, let's make users pay in proportion to the intensity of the frequency of use and what you might call the intensity of the use. If you put more pollutants into the water, you should pay more than the ordinary person who just takes a shower or uses the toilet. If you're driving a heavier vehicle, you should pay more per mile than a person driving a lighter vehicle. If you're driving during a time of high congestion, and you should pay a congestion fee, as we do for some electric utilities in the middle of summer, so as to avoid building a new plant whose only purpose is to provide peak capacity. So these are, fairly standard utility price setting 101 rules. Let's apply them to all these internal investments.
Is there any concern that some of it may be regressive taxation on those who are least among us?
Well, the solution to that is to go back to the prior discussion. We need to have a policy that makes it possible for everybody to have the work, the earnings, and the income that enables them to pay true market prices for food, for mortgage loans, for other utilities, including the ones I'm talking about: gas, electric, I would argue road, and so forth. The way to solve the progressivity issue is to enable everybody to pay real prices, and have plenty left over for saving money and saying they're buying books for their kids and going to the movies and going to the state fair and all of that, rather than have a complicated system that basically says, well, we're going to subsidize this user or that user. That leads to an endless set of subsidies. Shall we subsidize veterans regardless of income? Shall we subsidize seniors? I'm a senior. I get a subsidized pass to the national parks. Of course, I took advantage of it. I don't need a subsidy to go to Yellowstone. I can afford to pay the same price. Why should a lower income person have to pay more to see Old Faithful than I pay? it's not fair. It's not a fair system. So, you know, so we should get rid of all these subsidies. Half of the bills that are introduced in the Wisconsin legislature are bills to give some sort of break, a property tax break, a sales tax break, an income tax break to somebody's favorite, you know, favorite industry or pet cause. I mentioned pets because I think it's the case that certain kinds of haircuts for human beings are treated differently than haircuts for animals in Wisconsin. I think that's the case. You know,
Some pet store lobby got that.
Yeah, I mean, it's just ridiculous, all the tax breaks that are given, regardless of income. The regressivity that we have in our tax system is not fundamentally based on having poor people pay market prices. It's mostly on these huge tax breaks and giveaways that let the rich pay the same effective marginal tax rate as, you know, working class and middle class people. That's the problem. I actually don't favor a 70 or 90%, you know, marginal tax rate. I'd be happy if the total tax rate was, you know, when you add all the taxes together, federal, state, and so on, I'd be happy if it were 35 or 40% and paid, actually paid, which is what we have now. Is we've got, you know, this image of, oh, the rate should be 50, 60, 70%. But unless you get rid of all the exemptions, deductions, and exclusions that the rich and their accountants and lawyers take advantage of, we're never going to get anywhere close to that.
And the IRS chief was on record, I think, just 2 weeks ago, saying that the enforcement of taxes in the IRS for high earners, that we're missing potentially up to $1 trillion over the course of, I forget how many years he said. So even just basic enforcement on top of the removing some of these loopholes and trying to create a more equitable system.
We need better enforcement so that people don't illegally take advantage of the loopholes. But the fundamental problem is the loopholes themselves. Yeah. The problem with the loopholes, the big problem, is not that they are illegally used. The problem is that they're legal in the first place.
So this has been an incredible conversation. I'm going to make sure that I put the links into the notes about how people can get a copy of Putting Government in Its Place, the Case for a New Deal 3.0. So in closing, I would like to end on a little more optimistic note. And where do you see opportunity and hope in 2021 and beyond? And how can people engage with you?
Well, I'm always happy to you know, talk to people or correspond with them. So you know, my email address is driemermil@gmail.com. I think we have a possibility of hopeful reform. I close my book. I think the last title of the last chapter is Getting There. Mm-hmm. But I begin that by talking about how American history has been one in which things go on, often get worse, and then impossible good things happen that nobody would have imagined were possible. In 1774, no one would have imagined that these quarreling states with ragtag militias, you know, from New Hampshire down to Georgia, could ever possibly come to agreement, organize an effective army, appoint a competent general, and defeat one of the most powerful armies in the world, and create the first democratic republic, for all of its flaws, for all of its slavery and exclusions and so on, the first extensive republic in the history of the world. There had been nothing like it before. There had been small-scale republics, but nothing like the United States of America. It truly was amazing. And we should give a lot of credit to people who aren't often thanked. We tend to mention Washington and Jefferson, but they're great. My other heroes are John Adams and I think James Wilson, who played an important role in the Constitutional Convention. In 1860, no one would have imagined that only 3 years later, slavery would be legally abolished in the states in the deepest South, the ones that had rebelled. No one would have imagined that in 1865, a 13th Amendment would be passed that ended slavery legally, even though it took decades to truly end all the vestiges of slavery and even decades more to end segregation. And we're still fighting that. But no one, when they elected Abraham Lincoln, when he snuck into Washington, crammed into a sleeping car because they were worried he would be shot at even then, and the sleeping cars were too small for him. No one imagined in March of 1861 that within, just a few years, slavery would be abolished. It was astounding. No one imagined in 1932 that in 1935 we would have a giant jobs program, that we would have a federal minimum wage, that we would have unemployment insurance, that we would have Social Security, that we would have the right of workers to form unions and bargain collectively. That those were unimaginable ideas, and yet Franklin Roosevelt, with the help of Henry Wallace and Harry Hopkins, Frances Perkins, was extraordinary. She's often talked to about as the first woman cabinet member. That was the least of her extraordinary achievements. She was just amazing. And Harold Ickes and others, many others, were able to create the original New Deal. Had that not been there, there would have been no expansion of it. There would have been no Great Society. There would have been no Medicare. None of the things that I talked about before perhaps would have happened, like a Federal Legal Services Corporation. And I wouldn't have, written this book, a New Deal, about a New Deal 3.0. So that was an extraordinary feat. And I can go on and on about it. When John Kennedy said in 1961 or 62, we're going to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely within a decade, a lot of people thought that was, crazy. Some people still think the moon really is fake in the first place. But so the point I'm trying to make here is that American history is this history of things going up slowly or down slowly, sometimes even down bad. But then we have these moments where we leap forward to a new plateau of progress. And I do think that with Joe Biden as president, with this Congress, with frankly a lot of references to the New Deal, to Franklin Roosevelt, to Frances Perkins and Harry Hopkins, that we have a shot at creating what Biden himself referred to as a new paradigm. In my book, I talk, as you probably remember, how Franklin Roosevelt, in one of his campaign speeches in Pittsburgh, sort of referred somewhat fuzzily, as he often did, to the need for a complete change of concept of what the federal government would do. And he didn't know what it was going to be. None of his advisors knew. He had this happy expression, the New Deal. Nobody knew what it meant, but it emerged in the way I just described. Biden, just before going to Pittsburgh himself, ironically, talked about, we need a new paradigm. He actually said this 3 times in his first press conference. We need a new paradigm. We need a new paradigm. We need a new paradigm. I like to think that what I've written about in my book is an outline of what that new paradigm could be. But, like Roosevelt and his aides and like congressional supporters they had, we need to be creative and effective in turning that from an idea, a set of ideas and expression, into that nitty gritty of legislation and appropriations and budgets to make it come to life. Thank you. Thanks for this opportunity to talk. Really appreciate it, Evan.
David Riemer, thank you for all the work that you're doing, and let's make your book a reality and organize the political will to make it happen.